Good morning and welcome to the 7th Berwick Literary Festival. Whilst I'm in Berwick today, where our motto is "in a walled town, not in a tent," we're actually going 150 miles to the west for this session. And I'm delighted to welcome speakers and audiences from around the world. I am Michael Gallico, the chairman of the steering group of volunteers who organise this festival. And this morning's event is something new for us because it's an outside broadcast from Wigtown with Shaun Bythell in his bookshop, which is simply called the Bookshop. Even his publisher calls Shaun Scotland's grumpiest bookseller, and he has owned and run the shop for nearly 20 years. And recently, Shaun has published a series of entertaining, but also poignant and personal accounts of his experiences and diaries. And most recently, in his new book, 7 Kinds of People You Find in a Bookshop. Before we start, I'd like to say that this session is presented in celebration of the life of Simon Heald, the owner of Slightly Foxed Books here in Berwick, a strong supporter of this festival, and who I know shared Shaun's views of customers wholeheartedly. There's a slight break in this insofar as the first time this was recorded, a technical problem didn't quite catch the start of the session. And so my first question to Shaun was to ask him to say a little bit about Wigtown and Galloway. So please enjoy the session, and thank you for listening again.
But obviously being a peninsula, it's surrounded by the sea, so it's kind of got a little bit of everything. It's a beautiful place to live. The only problem is, like most of the west coast of Scotland, is quite wet.
You've got long-standing family connections though, haven't you? Which make me wonder why.
Well, they're not particularly long-standing. My parents moved here just before I was born, and they've always stayed here. Stayed here since I was born. But I moved away like lots of people because there wasn't much to keep you here. You know, if you go to university or whatever, most people who live here are self-employed. There's no heavy industry. There's no big businesses. So unless you've got a trade or you do what I do and run a shop, there's very little to keep you here, unless of course you're like a doctor or a lawyer or something. But I didn't particularly want to be a lawyer, and I'm not clever enough to be a doctor.
But yet you came back, didn't you? So how did you become a bookseller?
Sort of by accident, really. So I was living in Bristol, and in my early 20s, I made a very unwise choice. I wasn't going to have a conventional sort of career. And then I got to the age of 30, and I was just doing both financially and emotionally unfulfilling temping jobs. So, and I was back, I just turned 30, and I was back visiting my parents at Christmas, and I dropped into the shop to say hello to the previous owner. And he told me he was retiring and suggested that I bought the shop. And I thought, do you know what, this could be the only opportunity I get to actually do something I enjoy with my life. So I grabbed it with both hands, and I had to borrow the money from the bank to do it. But it's been really worthwhile. And I've, despite what you might conclude from reading the books, I do really love it. It's a great job.
Yeah. Can I ask, how did you learn the trade and the value of books?
That's a very good question. I think, like everybody who enters the secondhand book trade, you never stop learning. I mean, every day I find out something new. But the previous owner, John, was really kind to me, and he sort of took me under his wing for a few book deals. So when we were going out buying together, he would get me to, he gave me there are a few sort of rules of thumb. Antiquity tends to add value, but not necessarily. And then surprisingly, you find the odd relatively modern paperback that turns out to be worth a fortune. So I think probably the internet helped because you can always check things, but you can't necessarily do that when you're out buying, which is, so I suppose, yeah, it's just over time. I think in the time that I've been running the shop, lots of books come through your hands. So every day customers bring books in, and so you go through them and maybe take 20% of them, but you still handled the other 80% that you reject. And I think over the 20 years I've been here, I've probably handled about 1 million books. So you do sort of know what to look for. So hand-colored illustrations, copperplate engravings, that sort of thing, maps, yeah. And incunabula, which is the one thing I've never had, which is anything published before, I think it's the 1st of June 1500. So I had one book which was published in July, I think, 1500, and if it had been published a month earlier, it would have been worth about 10 times what it was worth. But yeah, you pick up things and people tell you things. People are quite keen to tell you things, sometimes a bit too keen. But so yeah, you're always learning.
Yeah, right. So there isn't really a difference between antiquarian and second-hand book selling then?
Well, technically antiquarian, I think the definition is anything over 100 years old. But not really, no. I mean, I think when you get really back, I always think of antiquarian really as being anything that's on handmade paper, which machine-made paper came into production using wood pulp in around about 1850, and you can see the difference in the texture of the paper. The handmade paper was made of rags, basically old clothes that gets pulped and then dried. And without wishing to get into a boring lecture about paper manufacturing, that for me, that's where anything that's published on handmade paper, sort of pre about 1950, tends to be more interesting, but not necessarily.
Okay. But was that 1500 book the most valuable one you've ever sold?
No, not by a long chalk. I think that went into an auction. It was a book called Martialis, which was the works of a Roman general marshal. And I think that made about £1,800 at auction. But the most valuable book that I've ever put into an auction was a set of books called Birds of America by J.J. And this, for secondhand booksellers, this is one of the sort of holy grails that you always hope to come across. But unfortunately, it was I put it in as a favor to a family friend who had inherited it, and they didn't really know what to do. So I said, right, the best thing really, I can't afford to buy it. So the best thing is to put it into a sale. So I collated it and tidied it up a bit, and that it's a 7 or 8 volume set, I can't remember, beautifully illustrated by Audubon, who famously captured all these. I mean, it was published in Edinburgh, actually, the first edition of the folio edition, or the elephant folio edition, and they're beautiful illustrations of all these exotic birds of America. And Audubon was sort of heralded as being this sort of great ornithologist. Apparently, he slaughtered birds by their thousands so that he was able to sort of mount them and paint them. But that made 37,500, which I got about £400 as a thank you. It's a bit gutting, but
yes. So 20 years, I suppose there must have been a huge amount of change in the business in that time.
Yes, and I would say probably from my point of view, not for the better. The secondhand book business has sort of withstood the ravages of Amazon and other big online giants, but it's I think probably before Amazon, and even when I bought the shop, Amazon was only selling new books. You couldn't get secondhand books on Amazon. So it was eating into the margins of new bookshops, but it didn't really bother secondhand bookshops very much. but yeah, it's driven prices down. People, whereas before you would have expected maybe, well, your prices to rise maybe with the rate of inflation or something, some comparable measure. It's a race to the bottom now because of online, particularly because of Amazon, where you can pick up books for a penny. So people come into the shop and they don't expect things for a penny. Obviously, they realise that we have overheads, but it has made people's expectations of what they have to pay for things, particularly books, I think, have changed dramatically, and I think that people don't want to pay much for things. And the other thing that hasn't helped is TV series where antique dealers go into antique shops and get things for a quarter of the sticker price. So people have sort of now have an expectation that if anything's secondhand, the price is negotiable, whereas we price to sell, we don't price to bargain. So those two things have kind of, certainly I think there was a stage where, I can't remember the exact figure, but somewhere between, I think around about 800 independent bookshops in the UK closed over around about a 10-year period. And that was a net closure. But I think now that trend's being slightly bucked, and I think people are realizing that the high street is changing, and that it is because of companies like Amazon. Shops are closing down. People have started to realize that if they want their high street to have a bit of charm and character and a few open shops, they have to pay maybe a little bit more and forego the convenience of having it delivered to their door the next day. So I'm hoping there's a bit of not necessarily a backlash, but just more of a consciousness about the impact that these businesses have on small business.
Yes, well, I think it is clear from your books that you have a rather difficult relationship with Amazon and the Kindle. But I mean, could you survive without it and the online internet?
Yes, I do. I decided 2 years ago that I wasn't going to sell online anymore, and I was purely going to sell through the shop. And it has meant a financial hit, but it hasn't been that big, because you maybe wouldn't be surprised, but when I was selling on Amazon, I reckon they were taking around about 30% of my online turnover. And I had the books in the shop, I was packaging them, Amazon never had to buy them. So 30% is, in a lot of cases, was more than my margin. So I thought, I feel like I'm working for Jeff Bezos, and I didn't get into this to work for Jeff Bezos. I got into it to work for myself. So we have taken a financial hit, but I think it's been a good thing, because the sort of whole anonymity of online buying and selling, there are things that people do that they wouldn't do in a face-to-face transaction. So we had a lot of situations, and I'm sure other booksellers would tell you the same, particularly second-hand books, where condition is always variable. With new books, obviously, you expect the condition to be new or mint. And we had customers buying something on Amazon for maybe £10. We sent it out, they received it, and then they said that we described it as being in very good condition, and there's a tear to the dust jacket or something, which is just obviously not true, and demanding 50% refund or something, and threatening negative feedback. So you're always answering emails and dealing with people trying to get money back, and all for Amazon to make more money. So I just decided it was time to cut my losses and get out. And interestingly, I noticed that the biggest bookshop in the world, Powell's, I think it was the 26th of August this year, made the same decision. And they said that essentially the CEO of Powell's, I can't remember what her name is, essentially said that she could see the damage that Amazon was doing to the communities in terms of the economy being almost ripped out of them. And she said, we can't, even though we make money selling on Amazon, we can't support this anymore, and in all conscience. And so they don't sell on Amazon anymore either. And there's another, it's turning into a real anti-Amazon rant, sorry. There's another thing that happened recently, which is the American Booksellers Association, the ABA, have just started a campaign. Amazon wanted, I think, to open an Amazon bookshop in Queens in New York. And the ABA started a campaign called Box Out, which is essentially to prevent Amazon from moving in, because they knew it would just result in independent bookshops closing down, and they succeeded, and Amazon's been essentially boxed out. So there is, I think there are the beginnings of a fight back. But how you fight back against such a massive organization it's impossible.
Mhm. I was going to ask you, I believe it's possible from your books to rent a bookshop for a holiday experience in Wigtown. Would you actually recommend someone to try taking it up as a business or a lifestyle business now on a full-time basis?
Yes, I would actually. I think you were talking about the open book, which is a project in Wigtown which nobody thought would work, but a few people had enough faith in it to risk it, including my parents who bought the property, where you can rent the open book for a week, the bookshop, and there's an apartment above it, and it's not very much, and you run the bookshop for a week, and there are a few rules, but you're pretty free to come and go as you please, and we thought that's, if we get a few bookings a year, it'll be interesting. It is booked solid, I think, for the next 20 years. So it's the Airbnb's most booked property. And all the people who come to do it, with almost without exception, have a really good time, and the community is extremely welcoming. And I think I remember when I told my friends in Bristol when I was leaving that I was coming back to Scotland to run a secondhand bookshop. Almost every one of them, and it had never really been a dream of mine or an ambition, almost every one of them said, that is my dream, I would love to do that. And it's surprising how many people share that dream. So for anybody thinking about doing it, I would say go for it. But the one thing I would say, which is always sort of, I think, quite prudent in any business, is know when to get out, know how much you can afford to lose, and if it doesn't work, don't just keep flogging it, because if it doesn't work after a couple of years, it's not going to work, unless things change dramatically.
Do you think bookshops are still attractive to young people? I'm talking now, people, school kids and students.
That's difficult, because most of my customers are retired, but not all of them. And I do get young families. Very, very rarely do I get school children or children. Yeah, I do actually, from Stranraer Academy. Sometimes I get little groups of people coming in. So I think probably they are still attractive to young people, but they're the young people who will turn into the older people who are my customers anyway. So if you see what I mean, there's always going to be a group within any age group who will be bookshop customers and who will be drawn to bookshops. It's just you see fewer of them around here. But yeah, I think bookshops, I go into Waterstones in Socky Hall Street, and there's loads of young people in there. So yeah, I hope that there's a new generation, and people like, well, the Harry Potter books, and there are plenty of young readers. And I suppose when they have enough money to come into a bookshop and buy the books for themselves, hopefully they will.
Perhaps we also sort of turn to your books. And I suppose I wondered, what made you think of publishing your diaries back in 2017, wasn't it?
I think probably like almost every secondhand bookseller in the country, when Jen Campbell's brilliant book, Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops, came out in 2012, I think it was. There must have been a collective kicking of ourselves, because everybody who works in a bookshop, certainly a secondhand bookshop, thinks probably almost on a daily basis, God, I should really write a book about this because so many strange things happen. So when Jen's book came out, I thought, I'd been thinking for a while, at some point I'll get around to writing a book, but my memory is just so shocking that I thought I'll sit down and I just won't remember anything. So I thought I'll just keep a diary, a daily diary of whatever happens. And that'll give me a sort of point of reference if I ever come around to sitting down in my retirement and actually writing. And then after a year, I didn't really know what to do with it. So one of the benefits of having a book festival where you actually have people face to face is that I got to know Jenny Brown, who's a literary agent in Edinburgh. And so I sent it to Jenny, the first draft, with a note saying, look, I know we're friends, but please, if it's absolute rubbish, just tell me. It won't damage our friendship. And Jenny thankfully saw something in it, which I was amazed by. But so it took quite a lot of work from the first draft. But yeah, I think probably everybody who works in a bookshop has a book in them, at least one. I noticed that there was a thing in the Bookseller or a publication recently about how there is now suddenly a spate of books appearing about books and bookshops, which seems to be a sort of not a new phenomenon, because there always have been booksellers and other people writing about bookshops, but it seems to be on the sort of slightly crest of a wave at the moment. So long may it last.
You mentioned the Wigtown Book Festival there, and I know it hasn't run this year, but can you just say a bit about that, since we're all festival goers here?
Yeah, sure. Well, it has run in the same way that Berwick's running it. But just obviously not with marquees and dancing and music and food. It's been the same as you guys online. So yeah, it's been going for, I think this is our 22nd year, and yeah, it's great. So in its infancy, God, there was some really, it was hilarious. It was a real seat of the pants, shoestring budget affair. So the first year, I think we had about 5 events over one weekend, and we had no money from marquees and things like that. So one of the speakers we had was David Mitchell, who wrote Cloud Atlas and Black Swan and various other things, and he'd been shortlisted for the Booker that year, which I think was 2002. And so I made, out of a sheet of tarpaulin and some old bits of wood with rusty nails sticking out of them, a sort of makeshift marquee in the garden. And we had an audience, I think, of 5 people, which if he'd been any other festival in the world, you know, he'd have packed out hundreds of seats. But because the festival was relatively unknown, nobody knew to kind of look for it. It's one of those things that has and I'm sure you'll be the same. Public awareness is what you're trying to build up, so that when your program comes out, you could produce the best program in the world, but if nobody knows about it, nobody's going to turn up. So it's about getting into the public eye. And over 20 years, we've gone from that 5-event weekend festival to about 300 events over. It used to be 10 days, and it seems to be creeping a day extra every year. So it's about 10, 12 days now. And it's, you know, huge audiences. People come from all over the world, and it's really, really good fun. I kind of miss the days when it was a bit shambolic, though. You know, there were some really amusing things happened.
Well, I hope my colleagues in the steering group are listening to that about dancing, music and booze. You've become a celebrity now. Your book's been translated into 20 languages, I think. How do you feel about being famous?
I don't feel famous. I don't think I am. I think I'm, it's what was really interesting, I think, for me particularly was the first book did really well in New Zealand because it got promoted by this wonderful journalist called Kim Hill, and so I got invited to do a tour of New Zealand during their springtime, and it was our autumn. So I went around all these places in New Zealand and packed auditoriums, 300, 400 people. And it was great. And I came back, my ego massively inflated, and then I had to do a talk in Lochthorne Library in Dumfries about a week after I got back. And 6 people turned up for it, and 3 of them slept through it. It sort of burst the bubble a bit, but it was good. And it's funny, I think the whole celebrity thing is, I think you're a celebrity if people recognize you, and nobody recognized. So I don't feel like a celebrity at all. I just feel like, people come into the shop and see this massive pile of copies of my book on the table, which I'm desperately trying to flog, and I haven't got a clue that it was me that wrote it. And I quite like that. There is still a degree of anonymity. I think that's, lots of writers will tell you that, is that, if you're on television, people recognize you, but if you're a writer, nobody really knows what you look like, on the whole, thankfully.
You talk about anonymity. In your books, you're quite direct, shall we say, with some of the comments you make about your staff, which I presume are pseudonyms, but they seem to live nearby. How do you manage this?
They're not pseudonyms. Those are their real names, I'm afraid. So in particular, in the first book, Nikki, who is the real star of the book, she and I worked. We're both working in the shop at the same time. I've got had my diary open, and I was writing it as things happened. So Nikki had full access to it. So I would write something halfway through the day. I'd sit down at Nikki's lunch break and type up what had happened. I'd say Nikki arrived 10 minutes late, blah blah blah, and lots of other things. And I'd get back to it in the evening and find that Nikki, who'd been ostensibly checking book prices or something, had changed it to say Nikki arrived 10 minutes early. She's such a hard worker. What would I do without her? So Nikki had read it all before it came out, so she was okay with it. And the others, the thing is, I don't say anything that isn't true. So you can't really be, okay, maybe embellish things slightly from time to time. But yeah, I think they can't really complain.
Yeah. I'm told you sold the television rights to your first book. When's it coming out?
I don't know. I have a feeling that production companies tend to buy up options in a way to quite often to prevent other production companies from having access to them. So I do wonder whether that might be what's going on here. But I certainly they bought the option about that must be a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and I know they've tried the BBC and they've tried a few other things, and nothing's happened yet. But well, fingers crossed, it will happen. But I'm not holding my breath.
Okay. Everyone who's heard this has said, "Who would you like to play yourself?" and who is going to play Nikki?
I don't really know. I don't really watch television or films. I'm so out of touch that I really couldn't guess. I was just say any scruffy-looking individual could play me, and Nikki's a more difficult one, actually. I don't know. I can't possibly answer that because for fear of severe retribution if I say something wrong.
Okay, well maybe the audience will email in their suggestions.
Yeah, I'm sure they won't be flattering.
Now people might read your new book, Seven Kinds of People, maybe in the hope of finding themselves in it, maybe the hope of finding themselves not in it. How did you narrow it down to 7 types of customer?
That's really difficult, actually, because in a sense, no two customers are the same. So, so you're looking for sort of general, overarching things that characteristics that it's maybe not necessarily about buying patterns. It's more about behavior. So there's a sort of combination of both. So I've got science fiction fan is one of the categories. So that is really, it's a combination of what they buy and how they behave. And in other cases, it's got nothing to do with what they buy. It's just entirely down to how they behave. So it was quite difficult. It took me a lot of sort of pencil chewing to actually be able to narrow it down. And within each category, there are several subgroups, as you know. So I've done just to really insult my customers, done a kind of Linnaean classification system where there's a genus. There are 7 genera, I suppose, is the plural of genus. And within each genus, there are different species. So, yes. God, it's going to insult everybody. I'm so sorry.
Well, who's your favourite type of customer?
Yes, a customer that I suppose spends a lot of money, doesn't say anything, just certainly doesn't complain. No, I think, to be honest, 90% of I mean, I think you do get the impression from reading my books that I really hate all my customers, but I don't. And 90% of them are charming and, polite and friendly. But it's definitely the 10% who aren't that are the ones that you remember. And there's a well-known psychological thing called the negativity bias, where, and the example that's always used is if you take the example of a married couple, and one partner does 9 nice things for the other partner in the day, buys flowers, makes lunch, whatever, but does one thing that upsets the other partner, the other partner will forget the other 9 things and just remember the one negative thing. So it's the same with me and customers. The nice ones tend to be kind of knocked into the long grass by the annoying ones.
There's an 8th section of your book about staff and the types of staff you have, and type 4 is the second-hand bookseller. Is this a self-portrait?
It is, but I think it's also a portrait of every other second-hand bookseller. And I think the example I give is from Sue Townsend's Adrian Mole. I can't remember which. Is it The Prostrate Years? And there's Bernard. Is it Bernard? I can't remember the guy's name now. But I remember reading it. It's this guy who works for
Bernard Hopkins. Yeah, it's
Bernard Hopkins,
Prostrate Years. Yeah.
Yeah. He's just the most unbelievably unlikable, dislikable character, and but at the same time, you kind of feel slightly a sort of degree of warmth towards him because he has this kind of encyclopedic knowledge, and is actually, he's such a passionate book lover that he won't sell books to people he thinks are undeserving of them. I mean, I don't share that characteristic. I'd be very happy to sell. And I love there's the thing she wrote. I'm really, really sad Sue Townsend's no longer with us, because her writing, I'd forgotten what a brilliant writer she is until I picked up an Adrian Mole book when I was on holiday a couple of years ago. And it's just fantastic. It's really good. And I love that Bernard Hopkins, when he phones up Waterstones, alarm bells go off. There's a big picture of him in a bookshop somewhere saying, "Do not employ this man." And I think that's what happens to you when you're a second-hand bookseller, and possibly every self-employed business, you get so used to doing things your way that you become unemployable. Nobody else in their right mind would give you a job because you'd just be unmanageable. And I think that's possibly why quite a lot of us become self-employed, because we can't cope with being told what to do by other people.
The postscript is titled The Perfect Customer. And so what kind of customer fills you with true joy?
The ones who you can see are genuinely passionate book lovers that come to the counter literally like a pile of books, that high, and that don't quibble. And you can just see the joy on their faces. And it happens surprisingly frequently, particularly during the summer. And it's people who obviously haven't been in a secondhand bookshop for a while, or live in a place where there's no secondhand bookshop, and they get the opportunity to come to one, and they just devour things. And they very rarely is all on one subject. It's usually a huge range of subjects, and they tend to be quite youngish actually as well. But they're just, you can see the delight on their faces, and that is actually a fairly infectious thing.
I think everyone would like to know what it is that a bookseller is reading at the moment.
I am currently reading a book that was recommended to me by Charlotte Higgins, which is Riceman Steps by Arnold Bennett. So I've started reading books about booksellers, and the main character is a guy called Mr. Earl Forward, who's a secondhand bookseller in this fictional place in London, and he is he's the most miserable, miserly character, and the more I read it, the more I see myself in this character, or parts of myself. But it's a really, really good book. I'm nearly finished it, and the book before that, which I read, was Nathaniel West's The Day of the Locust, which I would also thoroughly recommend. But that's not about booksellers, that's about Hollywood.
And are you writing again? Can we expect another book in a year or two?
I hope so. I keep my diary up to date every single day. So in draft form, so the second diary goes up to the end of, the start of 2016, I think. So I've got 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and so I've got nearly another 5 years in draft form. But it's whether or not there's an appetite for it, and whether or not my publisher's had enough of me by now. I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully there is. I think, the last time I checked, I think I had about 500 pages of A4, roughly. You'll know what that translates as into book size things. So it probably is about 5 books.
Right, okay. Because one question I was asked before this is there going to be a Wigtown Noir crime series?
I don't know. That's a good question. I could ask, do you know Lee Randall? She's a journalist, was for the Scotsman. She organises, I think it's Granite Noir in Aberdeen. So perhaps she could put pen to paper and come up with something, because she knows Wigtown very well, and she knows a lot of people, and she knows where the skeletons are buried.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Questions are queuing up, and can I remind them to put them through to the tech host in chat, please? We're conscious that you've got a job to go back to there. The first question I've got is, what are your favourite diary books, and did any of them inspire you to start writing?
No, I don't think I was a great reader of diaries before I started writing one, which I think maybe helped, because it meant I wasn't really trying to imitate anything. But I think probably the Adrian Mole, I have to say, is pretty hard to beat. She's relentlessly funny, very, very clever. and all the characters, you just recognize them. So yeah, I must read more diaries. I've got a pile actually in the photo. There we go. Here's one here that I haven't read, which I really ought to, which is Diary of a Nobody. But actually, the last diary, other than Sue Townsend one I read, was is it Brian Bilston, Diary of a Somebody, which is another spoof diary, which is a very, very funny book. And he was here at the festival last year, and it was very, very entertaining as well. So if you're looking for a festival guest, if we ever get round to having real festivals again, he's a good guy.
Mhm. I suppose I could ask here, what effect has COVID had on you this year? Has it encouraged reading?
On me, I thought it would, but in fact, what was I reading? I was reading The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt when we first got locked down, and I was about 100 pages from the end. And when we were allowed to open up, I realised I still hadn't finished it. So I didn't get much reading. I got a lot of gardening done, but I think it has had an impact on a lot of people who were locked down, and people who have a book in them. I suspect literary agents are going to be absolutely inundated with books now, because all the people who were stuck at home with nothing else to do, who have always had a dream of writing a book, will have written those books. And in fact, Jenny, my agent, said that one of her colleagues, I don't know who it was, I can't remember, received 2 manuscripts on the same day in the middle of lockdown, both called virus ! So I think there might be a fair bit of that coming out.
Yeah. You mentioned the economic impact of the lack of a festival in Wigtown, and one of the reasons for starting the Berwick Festival was to give an economic fillip, because this is not the wealthiest of towns either. What was the impact on your business of COVID and the lockdown?
The lockdown, we were closed for 116 days, so obviously we had no income, but because we're ratepayers, we got the subsidy, the grant actually, which I suspect will turn out to be more than I would have made in profit had we been open. But I think the impact of COVID and lockdown has been that as soon as we reopened, we've never been so busy. The town, the shop, it's been busier than it's ever been, even during the festival. And I think it's just because people have missed. First of all, people are staying in the UK for their holidays, and secondly, I think people have just really missed going into bookshops and are kind of making up for lost time. So, in that respect, the negative has been balanced out by the positive post-lockdown. But I think now that things are tightening up again, as regards movement and travel and things, I think we're going to go back into a sort of depressed economy.
The questions are building up here. To ask you if you get visits from fans, and if so, what sort of characters are they?
I don't know if I'd call them fans, but I definitely get a lot of visits from people who've read the book, and they generally, most of them probably don't say that they've read it. Quite a few of them come to the counter and say, "I've read your book, so I'm not going to say anything stupid," and then continue to say something stupid. Those are the best, because when I first had the shop, door would open and customers would come in. I'd be quite excited, thinking, "Oh, I wonder who this is," and then eventually you kind of get sick of them, and then you get to the point where you've had so many encounters with the rude people that the door opens, the door to the shop opens, the bell goes, and you think, "Oh God, who's coming in now? What are they going to say?" But since starting to write the book, keeping the diary, now whenever a customer comes in, I'm positively hoping that they're going to be rude or say something offensive, because that gives me something to write about. So it's sort of changed my view of customers.
You actually sort of get families who come in and just relax and drop us asleep in the shop.
Yeah, especially during the school holidays. Obviously, is when you mostly get families, but even you do regularly. I quite like it when families come in, because I think it's, in a way, it's creating a culture for the children of, not being afraid to go into bookshops, and I think that's a fear some people do have. People think they're going to be made to look stupid by, either staff or by what they buy, or and that's absolutely not the case. Even when people say something that is stupid, I wouldn't be rude enough to point it out to them. And we all say stupid things, so I don't think it's a crime. But yeah, it does kind of sadden me that some people do feel intimidated by bookshops, and I think hopefully by parents bringing young children in, they'll get used to them and not be afraid of them.
I've got a question here. How should we ethically go about searching for specific secondhand books without using Amazon or Abe Books?
That's a very difficult question. I think there's a new non-Amazon Abe thing that's come out, which I can't remember the name of. I think it's just in America at the moment, but hopefully it's going to become a global thing. But yeah, you can always, I think, go into a bookshop and ask them. And we used to have before the internet, we used to have a sort of network of, if a customer was looking for something, word would get round, and anybody who had it would make it available to the customer. So it's difficult because Abe is so dominant now, that I remember doing a talk somewhere, I can't remember where it was, talking about Amazon, and basically somebody was saying, well, there are alternatives, and he listed about 5, and every single one he mentioned, someone in the audience shouted, bought by Amazon in 2006, bought by Amazon in 2010, 2010. So anything that grows sufficiently to look like it might be a threat, they just consume it. So it's quite hard, but I would say just go into bookshops and ask, probably is your best bet.
Okay. Do charity shops get into the sector and get stock that really ought to go through the book trade?
So this is something I've written about, because my friend Ian had a bookshop in Hull, and it's a slightly thin ice, because people love charity shops and like supporting charities. But Ian's bookshop was near the university in Hull, and Oxfam opened a shop, a general charity shop, about 3 doors down from him, and he went to his local councillor and said, can you get it in writing that they're not going to turn this into an Oxfam bookshop? And Oxfam said, yeah, we're not going to do that, we promise. And then a year later they did, and it put Ian out of business. And now, arguably, it's competition, it's free market, whatever. But as Ian said, the economics for the local economy of that are, if people want to have books to sell, if they went into Ian's shop, he would give them money for them. So that money would stay in the economy. If people give them to the Oxfam bookshop, they don't get anything back for them. Ian's profit, Ian employs local people, or employed local people. Oxfam volunteers. Someone's going to pull me up on this, because I'm sure that Oxfam does pay managers. And the third thing is that all the money generated by Ian's business, the secondhand bookshop, stays in the local economy. Whereas with Oxfam, obviously, it's doing good work and it's going overseas to support needy causes, worthy causes. But just in terms of local economics, I think secondhand bookshops provide more than charity bookshops. I think there's a place for everyone. It's just how we manage it. I'm going to get absolutely rocketed for that, aren't I?
I don't think so. Right, one last question, and I know where this one comes from. Does Shaun have a bookshop dog?
No, but we have a bookshop cat that's the size of a small dog. In fact, we've had to put, he's become increasingly territorial, and whereas when he was much smaller, I mean, he's huge. He's called Captain after Captain Cat in Undermilk Wood. When he was much smaller, customers would come in with dogs and he'd scamper and run up the stairs. And now he holds his ground. And in fact, he actively goes out looking for dogs now. So there's a woman who lives in Wigtown, Mary, who's got a Staffy, a really stocky Staffordshire Bull Terrier. It's a beautiful dog. And she was telling me the other day that the dog, when she's taking the dog for a walk, it refuses to walk past the bookshop because it's scared of the cat. So we may be getting a dog, I don't know. I think cats are more bookshoppy than dogs.
Well, I think on that, I should call this to an end. Thank you very much, Shaun.
That's my pleasure, thank you.
There's just one disappointment. We've not seen any of your cast of characters walk behind you. We were hoping to see some of your customers and see if they lived up to the write-up you've given them.
Shall I take you on a quick tour?
Yes, we'd love that. Thank you.
We might drop out a Wi-Fi signal, but I can show you a couple of bookshop characters, one of which is the Badger. I don't know if you can see that.
Good. COVID.
Bookshop Badger obviously with his mask on, and I think we've got some customers in. I heard some, but we've sort of fenced off. Let's see. We might lose signal here. Nikki, do you want to put in an appearance? You want to say hello?
Oh, hello. Sorry.
So that's the new Nikki. We've replaced Nikki with Nikki. Zero. But yes, no customers. Well, I could hear them earlier, but they've obviously gone.
Well, thank you very much again, Shaun, for that. It's a fascinating account, of the business that you're in and of your new book, which of course is best bought from the bookshop in Wigtown. If you go to Shaun's website, and he will have signed copies for you. And I honestly really would recommend, if you've not been to Wigtown, go. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's not so far from here, Berwick. And if you've enjoyed this session, please look at our website and see what else we have on for the rest of the festival until Sunday. Still plenty of space, and please tell your friends on social media if you've enjoyed this talk. And you'll shortly see the donation link on our chat page. So thank you to the audience for listening and joining in here. I hope you've enjoyed that. And don't forget, our next festival will be in 14th to the 17th of October next year. And of course, the Wigtown Book Festival will be in September 2021. So once again, thank you, Shaun. That's been incredibly interesting. And if we could applaud, we would. But it's one of the problems with Zoom. It's not as personal as we would like. So thank you, and thank you to everybody again for joining us here in Berwick and in Wigtown.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.